Circular trade is a key enabler of a global circular economy, but inequities in power relations, digital trade capabilities, trade infrastructure, access to finance, and industrial and innovation capabilities mean that countries in the global north are better positioned to reap the benefits than those in the global south. Emerging economies in the global south are often the final destinations for internationally traded low-value goods or illegal waste. Lack of capacity in these countries to properly manage and treat such waste brings greater environmental risks and social burdens. If an explicit goal to reduce inequality is not built into the global circular economy transition, the gains to be made from circular trade are likely to be highly unevenly distributed between the industrialized and emerging economies. Notably, the circular economy clearly challenges the linear take, make, dispose aspect of today's trade policies. Throughout global supply chains, a lot of waste is created. Most sectoral global supply chains are not sustainable and far from circular. The current trade policy frameworks are not supportive of an adoption of circular value chains. Therefore, there's a need for trade policy measures and tools to be leveraged to make circular value chains a success. A very warm welcome to everyone present here today. I'm Apurva Arya, and I'm the founder and CEO of the Circular Innovation Lab. We work with national governments, UN agencies, and international organizations to accelerate the transition to a circular economy. One of our focus areas is trade and circular economy, and we're currently working on a study on circular economy and international trade in India. We are co-hosting today's event with Chatham House and the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development in collaboration with the International Trade Center and the European Environmental Bureau as knowledge partners. And today's panel discussion will discuss the opportunities and challenges for emerging economies to boost circular trade. The event will be divided into two sessions. The first session will discuss challenges and key bottlenecks in developing policy frameworks within trade and circular value chains in emerging economies. And the second session will look at trade policy solutions that can be leveraged to accelerate this transition. It gives me immense pleasure to invite our first moderator for session one, Dr. Patrick Schroeder, who is a senior research fellow in the Environment and Society program at the Chatham House. He specializes in research on the global transition to an inclusive circular economy with a specific focus on collaborative opportunities between key countries, closing the investment gap and building an evidence base for trade in circular economy. Over to you, Patrick.
Yeah, thank you, Apurva. Thank you for the introduction. And welcome also to all the panelists that we have and all the participants. Thanks for joining us today. Probably after a busy week on a Friday afternoon, it's great to see so many of you joining. Obviously, this is an important topic that is being discussed increasingly on international level. There's an increasing number of publications and discussions taking place, and we hope also today to contribute to advancing some of the solutions that we need to put in place. So what we have, we'll have, as Apurva mentioned, in this first session, we want to focus on the challenges that we have, and there's sufficient challenges around. We also would like to hear from you as the audience. The Q&A chat is enabled, so as you were listening to the presentations that we have, please enter your questions into the Q&A, and there will be about 20 minutes at the end of this first session, and then we get the panelists to talk about this. So we really would like to make this interactive and hear from you. So don't hold back. Everything that you'd like to ask or comment on, please put it in the chat. And other than that, I think we're ready to go with our first panelist. And this is Dr. Rajesh Agarwal from the International Trade Center. So he's Chief of Business and Trade Policy. And we'd like to ask you the question about what type of trade policy interventions and trade policy tools are required to support the shift to a circular economy. And then again, as I mentioned, what are the particular challenges you see in implementing these? Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Patrick. First of all, thank you for inviting me to this important panel. And as perhaps you know, International Trade Center, which I represent, it builds capacity of SMEs in developing and the least developed countries to internationalize. And therefore, the focus of my reply to the questions that you have posed will be, trying to answer a question that how can the trend towards adoption of circular economy principles for ensuring environmental sustainability, is it giving a fillip to industrial development in developing countries? And what is the role and challenges of trade policy in doing so? So I'll start by an attempt to understand what circular economy is in common parlance. I know that OECD has given a definition, etc., but just let me state for common understanding in common man's parlance. It is, amongst others, recycling, product repairing, reusing, refurbishing, and increasing material productivity. Essentially, this is an illustrative list of what the circular economy would mean to in common parlance. Now, international trade can provide potential opportunities to transform waste into resources. On the import side, it can contribute to achieving economies of scale in collecting waste destined for recycling and recovery operations and meeting consumer needs in a cost-effective manner. And on the export side, it can contribute to value realization by selling secondary raw materials, recycled or refurbished goods, etc. Now, the countries which would like to join the circular economy bandwagon will have to incentivize such a transition through an appropriate policy mix comprising domestic regulations as well as trade policies, albeit within the confines of existing multilateral or regional trade treaties, and in this process also explore if new provisions need to be negotiated to cater to certain special conditions of circular economy. Now, the circular economy-based business models will succeed only if it is more cost competitive compared to the existing business models, which are based on use of primary raw materials. And the trade policy and attendant regulations should provide an enabling environment for this objective to be achieved. Now, I can think of some policy measures. One, obviously, the subsidization of secondary materials or recycling sector. However, if I'm talking about low-income developing countries and LDCs, first question is whether they have the financial resources to subsidize. And if they have, they should design the subsidy schemes in a non-discriminatory manner. This is what flows from some of the disputes even which has gone to WTO in this respect. And, for example, non-discrimination between imports and domestically produced goods, besides respecting all other provisions of the WTO subsidies agreement. Second, I'll put it as facilitate acquisition of technology for circular economy related processes. And one important source of acquiring technology is inward foreign direct investment. And I would say that, there should all the means, whether it is through market access or simplified procedures of investment facilitation, should be put in place if you really want to acquire technology which you cannot provide, domestically. Third, ensure cost-effective supply of raw materials, which are waste and scrap, second-hand automobiles, textiles, or electronic gadgets, etc. Now, these can be collected domestically, as we all know, but more likely need to be imported for refurbishing and recycling industries to benefit from economies of scale. Then only they'll become cost competitive. And when countries allow imports, many issues besides tariffs, which are always, a trade policy issue, besides tariff will arise. First, for example, do these countries have appropriate regulations and implementation machinery in place to prevent hazardous and environmentally undesirable waste products being dumped into their territory? If not, they must do that. Second, do these countries have recycling, refurbishing, remanufacturing capacity? Otherwise, the waste will litter all around, including sometimes on their beautiful sea beaches, which may have actually an adverse impact on their tourism industry. At this stage, I would also like to talk about a traditional industrial policy issue in this regard, which has an impact on the import policy of countries. Many countries do not allow import of second-hand automobiles or clothes for consumption purposes, as it may have an adverse impact on their existing automobile, textiles, clothing industry. Therefore, countries would have to take an informed decision after weighing the pros and cons of different scenarios in their specific domestic context. Now, if countries decide to go down the route of seizing new opportunities arising from circular economy business models, imports of raw materials in the form of waste and scrap, second-hand products would be essential, as I said, from benefit from economies of scale. But these countries necessarily need to take care that special characteristics of such imported products and the new regulations in this area do not become a new class of non-tariff obstacles to trade, which would hamper what the countries want to gain, that is cost competitiveness of circular economy based business models. Now, prevent emergence of new non-tariff obstacles. It is essential that customs clearance of such products is facilitated by overcoming difficulties. Well-stated difficulties like the current HS codes alone may not cover waste and scrap, which may not be able to distinguish between those, or hazardous or non-hazardous, as also to distinguish waste from second-hand goods. What I want to say is that unless a clarity is established, this can delay customs clearance at the border and even introduce unpredictability of decisions, which businesses detests the most due to discretionary powers which may be vested in the customs officials. Now, while preventing the inflow of hazardous substances is essential, but equally important is to ensure seamless, standardized trade facilitatory measures to import legally permissible goods to ensure cost competitiveness. I mean, I'm emphasizing on the word of cost competitiveness. That is what is going to determine whether developing countries or the least developed countries are able to take advantage of this new business model. Now, to complete the story on the export side, for secondary raw materials obtained through processing waste and scrap, refurbished or repaired goods to enter into global or regional value chains, transparency of environmental footprint information throughout a product's value chain, traceability, so-called, environmental labeling, conformity compliance with sustainable standards, responsible business conduct, etc., would be an advantage and perhaps an absolute necessity if these countries want to realize appropriate value of the products processed using these new circular economy business models. Now, to conclude, I would like to say that circular economy business models operating in an appropriate trade policy regulatory environment can channel waste and scrap to countries with comparative advantage, which I believe many developing countries have comparative advantage in sorting and processing them into valuable materials. And definitely it is a potential new opportunity for industrial development for them. I think this will generate a positive momentum and not only criticizing, that there are only challenges and not opportunities for developing countries. So they can use it as an opportunity if they can put a coherent trade policy regulatory regime in place. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Agarwal. That's really good start to the session. You highlighted a whole range of issues and challenges here, ranging from the subsidies for renewable resource use, then facilitating technology acquisition, issues around customs procedures and the capacity, and then the question also how to prevent hazardous waste imports, but at the same time how to create these standardized procedures for secondary materials so that developing countries can use their competitive advantage for the circular economy. I think we will hear, a lot more about these. That's really good to set the scene. And yeah, if you have in the audience, if you have any specific questions on these points, please put this in the Q&A, and we'll get to that then after the next presentation. So we move now to the next speaker, Mr. Jocelyn Valerio, who's the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the executive leader of institutions, governments, and cities. And the question we have for you relates to the EU policy environment or regulations in the European Union. So what do you see as the potential challenges that emerging economies, developing countries might face when they have to comply with upcoming EU regulations such as the Sustainable Product Initiative or the Sustainable Textile Strategy, which are currently in preparation? Over to you, Jos.
Thank you, Patrick. And thank you, Dr. Agarwal, for setting the scene so well. You've touched on really the whole range of topics that really frame this discussion. I think to answer your question really directly, Patrick, it feels like, of course, all of these measures that tend to create a better grasp on what's put on the market, on the European market, in terms of volume, in terms of feedstock, in terms of the nature of the products, of course, is destined to have a positive effect on those markets, tending that to circularize the right things. Because if we, of course, close the loop on the wrong materials, then we compound toxicity, and there's a raft of other problems that comes with that. So acting throughout the value chain in order to make sure this doesn't happen is absolutely essential. It does also put quite a lot of burden on the producing countries when it comes to acquisition of technology, recycling facilities in some cases, new sourcing, new production materials, new processes, new design elements as well. And of course, this has to be accompanied by support, both technical and probably financial as well, in order for those producing countries, which let's remind ourselves of the fact also that they do produce for the European consumer. So therefore, it's a two-way street. It's not a question only of imposing new norms for the sake of protecting the market and the European consumers and eventually greening those supply chains, but it's also a question of making sure that we can upscale, we can help when it comes to the producing countries, making sure, for instance, that the informality of the material collection systems can be professionalized, that the people who work in those material streams and with the raw materials, the extraction sector or the repurposing sector are not exposed to the wrong materials, the toxicity, etc. And of course, the other side of the coin is looking at the measures that countries take in order to make sure that they don't end up on the wrong side of the material chain. And I'll take the example of the Chinese national sword policy banning the import of waste plastics, which, if it's not a circularity enabling measure in itself, at the very least, I would qualify it as a barrier to linearity. It prevents from simply putting stuff on the market, using it, and then sending it back somewhere away, hoping that it will be dealt with in a proper manner, labeling that as recycling in most cases. Well, when away fights back, this is what we have. And therefore, the stuff stays where it was used and consumed. Some of it goes to countries with even less of a capacity to collect and to sort properly. And some of it simply stays and gets accumulated and therefore becomes the problem of the consuming countries. And this is where it's also an interesting dynamic, because there is that notion of greening the value chain and putting measures in place when it comes to potentially banning the import of products that are generating deforestation, for instance. And the principle is sound and everything is really good, but because it's a systemic shift, the burden should be also shared, and the understanding of what needs to be put in place in terms of investment and upskilling is a global conversation. It cannot be simply a one-way directional imposed by the consuming countries. So I guess the in very concrete terms, if we look, for instance, let's take the textile sector and the European textile strategy. According to the Vietnam national broadcaster, who has done a bit of research on this, only 5% of their production capacity in Vietnam when it comes to textiles currently comply to the norms that can be foreseen if we push the logic of the European textile strategy. That means that 95% of the production capacity will have to either close shop, and that will have an impact on the availability of those products, which in a very completely clinical and non-judgmental way could be a good thing when it comes to addressing the problem of overconsumption of some of those textiles, bearing in mind that the average European consumer throws away about 12 kilos of textiles per year. And according to the figures, those have been worn 7 to 8 times no more. So there is also a question of waste, and addressing the material consumption of our market is part of that discussion as well, bearing in mind, of course, that this provides income and livelihood to many people along the value chain. So this is why it's never a question of simply saying, you know, we're going to circularize this by imposing norms and cleaning up some value chains at the end, but also what is the impact. And as Apurva was saying, you know, in our introduction, we need to make sure that we understand where the creative destruction is going to happen, who's going to benefit from this. And of course, let's not be naive, the geopolitical tensions around countries who derive their GDP from the sales of raw materials, resources, or certain practices that we have been very eager to offshore for various reasons, whether that's labor cost or environmental impact, need to be taken into account. This is a system change discussion that we're having. Trade is a really important part of it. We're talking about shifting material flows and the regulations that preside over them for the benefit of the users, the producers, and the ecosystems in general. I'll stop there for the moment. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Jos. I very much like your point about that this is a global conversation about systems change. So that all the challenges around upskilling, professionalization, investment, needs to be discussed at the global level, rather than something that's being imposed as a new norm. I think the example that you gave of China's national sword policy from, I think, back in 2018 or so is actually a good example how a large policy direction shift can have a lot of unintended consequences that haven't been, especially if there hasn't been a lot of international discussion on how to implement it in the right way. So that's something definitely for the EU also to consider. Okay, great. So I see there are some questions coming into the Q&A. There's also a function where you can vote up questions, so that the thumbs up. So if you like a specific question, you can just click that, and then that gives us, or helps us also to see the priorities of questions that we should look at. So please have a look. And yeah, I see lots of new questions coming in. That's great. So then we move on to the next speaker, Mr. Shunta Yamaguchi. Shunta is with the OECD Environment Directorate, so you're a policy analyst there, and you've been looking at trade and circular economy for quite a while. And you just recently published a new report. And I would like to ask you about the main challenges you identified in this new report, which is on the facilitation of cross-border reverse supply chains for resource efficient and circular economy. Over to you, Shunta.
Yes, thank you very much, Patrick, for the nice introduction, and also thank you to the organizers for the very kind invitation as well. I think the Dr. Agrawal set the scene very well, and the intervention from Jos also laid out a lot of sort of the the opportunities and challenges of upstream efforts and how that can affect downstream. The work that we've recently produced on securing reverse supply chains towards a resource efficient and circular economy focuses more on the downstream aspects on the end-of-life products and how there might be some opportunities for trade or not. And the starting point really is that a lot of companies that are pursuing circular business models often rely on reverse supply chains and reverse logistics to collect end-of-life products and re-inject reusable materials back into the production process. And these reverse supply chains can also help economies to be more circular by closing material loops, such as through recycling, repair, refurbishment, and remanufacturing. And a lot of times, these initiatives can also extend beyond borders and require the transboundary movement of end-of-life products. But at the same time, a lot of recent international developments focus on increasing controls, such as the Chinese import bans that kicked in since 2018 that we were just discussing. Also more recently, the plastic waste amendments to the Basel Convention since 2021, and also e-waste amendments to the Basel Convention that will kick in from 2025. So the question is how to really strike the right balance between trade and circular economy objectives. And we further looked into some barriers that are faced by businesses in this respect. I'd like to touch upon 6 of them. So the first one is the procedural burdens and delays in cross-border shipment of end-of-life products. And in some cases, there are reports that it can take from 14 to over 42 months to obtain consent under the prior informed consent procedures under the Basel Convention and the OECD decision. And this is actually much more longer compared to the standard process of 1 month under the OECD decision and 2 months under the Basel Convention. And therefore, shipments can be more costly and work against business predictability that Dr. Agarwal was talking earlier on. The second point is around definitions and classification, where there's a patchwork of diverging definitions and classification of waste, secondhand goods, and goods for refurbishment and manufacturing, or secondary raw materials. And a lot of industry or economic operators need to navigate through this patchwork, which is very challenging. The third point is of the nature of custom controls, which often focuses on the physical characteristic of the traded product. Whereas for the circular economy, what's really important is how they are produced, whether they include hazardous materials or not, how much they're recyclable, or how they're treated at destination, how much they contribute to circular use. So there's a question about how borders controls could be, if and how they can be complemented by additional measures, if this is ever possible or not. The fourth point is around trade restrictions and import and export restrictions on end-of-life products, where, for example, 40% of globally traded copper waste and scrap face some kind of export restrictions, and these would work against securing cross-border reverse supply chains. So this is an aspect to look upon. The fifth aspect is around illegal waste trade, which undermines legitimate traders and also competent recyclers for competition. And we need to look to tackle them as well. And finally, there could be issues around upstream, where such as eco-design initiatives, securing recyclability, repairability, phasing out hazardous substances that Joss was elaborating right now. These could generally work in favor of cross-border reverse logistics and also make the economy more circular in general. However, we also want to keep in mind that we do not want the fragmentation of such standards and regulations, so that businesses can also benefit from trade and also benefit from economies of scale. And all of these issues are still at the very early stage for consideration, and further discussions really need to happen around these areas. So These are sort of the initial findings from this report, and I'd like to hand back over to Patrick. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shunta, for outlining those 6 points that you have in your report. I think, striking the right balance is important, but then also at the other point, I think that I mentioned at the end, how to avoid the fragmentation of standards, because there are now a lot of initiatives underway on the standard side. ISO, for example, being one, and of what I've heard, there's also a very, very complicated process the ISO is dealing with in terms of the definition and then what it means in the end also for trade, I think. So it's definitely, as you said, it's early stages, definitely a space to watch. And I put the link to Shunta's report in the chat. I hope everybody can see that. Yes, so I think we need to forward it to the audience. At the moment, it's only the hosts and panelists that can see the link, but we'll do that as we move to our next speaker. So we move now to Christoph Bellman. He's with the Forum on Trade, Environment and the SDGs based in Geneva. And so you're head of policy analysis and strategy. And you're working a lot around the WTO, and that's also what our question is. I'd like to hear from you a bit more about the challenges that the multilateral trade system and the WTO will face regarding the circular economy transition, and maybe specifically a little bit, if you could say, whether the WTO will become a barrier or an enabler of the transition, because I think it could go both ways. Maybe you could expand on that a little bit. Over to you, Christoph.
Thank you, Patrick, and thanks for the invitations. I think between the three speakers before me, we've probably covered all the important aspects. So let me see if I can add or expand at least on some of the points. But to start with, your second question, is the WTO likely to be a barrier or a problem? Well, let me say that it's probably not going to be a barrier to the circular economy, I would think. I mean, if you look at existing rules, and this has been confirmed pretty much in the jurisprudence, there's ample flexibilities for countries and members to adopt what I would call good faith environmental policies. I mean, those that really pursue legitimate environmental goals, as opposed to those that are kind of disguised protectionist measures, or that discriminate in countries or actors where the same condition prevails. And in fact, many of the measures that have been declared as WTO incompatible in the past were not for environmental reasons, but because they failed to pass that non-discriminatory test. That said, it's clear that the circular economy, I think, poses a number of practical and conceptual challenges for the system, and it will have to deal with it. Probably the most critical, and it's been mentioned, is really this idea of how do you distinguish goods based on circular economy considerations. First, can you treat them differently based on how they're produced, whether they're primary or secondary raw material, when the process and production methods that have been used are not really reflected in the final product, or in the physical characteristics of the final product. But that's not really a new debate, and it's been there for quite a long time, and you see it in many other areas. Think about carbon content of goods. But the circular economy brings an additional complexity, which relates to how do we differentiate goods also based on their intended use. In other words, can you discriminate or differentiate products based on how they will be used once they have been imported? Can you make a distinction between electronic waste for disposal and electronic waste that will be used for recycling? Can you distinguish, machines that are imported as for disposal waste, or that are imported for being refurbished or remanufactured? And I think making this distinction is not completely, well, it's really relevant, first of all, for the purpose of trade data and trade collections. For example, we don't know now, because we can't distinguish things, we don't know how much goods are, second-hand goods are being traded, the scope of trade in remanufactured goods, because we don't have the data. But it's also essential for governments to adapt trade-related measures or incentives to promote the circular economy transition. So, for example, can a government apply lower tariffs on goods for remanufacturing and refurbishing compared to the same goods if they're imported as waste? And I think that's really a kind of fundamental question that needs to be addressed. One has, you can do it by, looking at the harmonized system, and can we look at the different, which provides the different codes or that classify goods internationally. Can we make those distinctions there? But the same problem occurs here, because the way the harmonized system works is really based on the physical characteristics of goods. So I think that's probably one of the biggest challenge. But beyond this kind of more technical issues, maybe I can just share two issues that have been raised, maybe particularly by developing countries, in addition to this one, in discussions in the WTO. There's been, well, for those who are not familiar with the discussions there, this discussion on trade and circular economy is something that is really gathering momentum, and there's a lot of interest, I think, in exploring how cooperation and trade policy can really support the circular economy transitions. We have a whole discussion on plastic pollution. There's a dedicated working group on trade and circular economy under the trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions. So there's a lot of interest. It's a really new topic. And maybe two aspects that are of particular concern. I think one is a fear, mostly by developing countries, that this discussion exclusively focuses on the end-of-life stage, on recycling, on waste management, even on second-hand goods and goods for remanufacturing. And in fact, if we listen what that's precisely what we've been discussing during this whole meeting. But for these countries, there should be a much stronger emphasis on the reduced side of the equation and on the substitute side of the equation, particularly when you talk about plastics. There is a fear that we're all using these discussions to enable countries to continue produce plastics, and you will just recycle them. Whereas what is actually needed is to reduce production and trade, and of course trade instruments need to be used in that respect. The second concern, of course, which has been alluded to, is this kind of proliferation of different standards and regulations, be it EPR schemes or even different definitions of what constitutes hazardous, non-hazardous goods. And all this generates additional costs. We've heard about the cost of complying with those requirements, but also this kind of regulatory heterogeneity and the differences across countries is an additional problem and a challenge for developing countries particularly, and calls for some form of cooperation to try to reduce these differences. So let me maybe stop there, and we can continue in the discussion. Thank you.
It's great. Thank you very much, Christophe. I'm very pleased to hear what you were saying about the gathering momentum within the WTO discussions on trade and circular economy. That's really encouraging to hear. And also, the other points you made about how to distinguish these different types of goods and services, I think, yeah, very, very important issue that probably can only be addressed by the WTO. No, that's great. I think, yeah, we have about 15-20 minutes for some of the Q&A, and there's quite a few questions that came in. So thanks for everyone for posting those. And I think I'll start with the one that was raised here by Piotr Bazak. Piotr's actually from the EB, the European Environmental Bureau, who are Evie, just to mention also one of the knowledge partners for the workshop today. So Piotr is asking if is trading waste across continents hampering the waste collection systems and treatment in either the receiving or sending country, or even both. So yeah, a question about whether this is actually maybe counterproductive to trade waste across borders for both countries. I think it's a good question. Who would like to try to tackle that? Maybe Dr. Agarwal, would you like to try to answer that one? You need to, we can't hear you.
I'm just saying that I don't think I'm the best person to answer that question. There are, better qualified people to answer this question, in the panel. So please.
Right, maybe over to Joss. Maybe do you want to take that one?
Well, I think it's I'm with the same reaction. Actually, it's a valid question. I don't think that beyond that we've done the work or we have a really good answer. And also, I think looking at what we talk about when we talk about waste, it really depends on the quality, the quantity of the materials, where they can be processed as well. The materials is only as good as what we can make of it, and if there's no capacity, or if it's not being processed in the right place, then it doesn't really add to the economic value, or it doesn't really bring anything when it comes to jobs creation either. So I think it's a valid question to bear in mind. I don't think that we've done the research that allows me to have an authoritative response right now. It definitely is a question to be asked whenever we consider circularization of certain types of materials that have a global footprint when it comes to the value chains that they depend on. But I'm not entirely sure we can come up with a silver bullet or a blanket answer to that question, however pertinent it is.
Yeah, thank you, Joss.
Patrick, if I may also come in.
Sure, of course.
Yes, but I don't have a better answer than Joss, actually, but to really echo that this really depends, and it's a very valid answer. Of course, if there's circular economy solutions domestically and there's enough capacity domestically to treat these wastes in a economically feasible and environmentally sound manner, I think that could be viable, and there might not be a role for trade. But in other situations, there are situations where you can't achieve scalability in your domestic markets, and you need to draw on trade opportunities. There are also areas where there like recycling of emerging technologies, such as, let's say, for batteries, or maybe renewable energy solutions or energy storage, where these have not reached end of life yet, but there will be more and more opportunities, or we need to look at how they could be treated. And when they're in sort of a transition phase, there would be a need to look into trade opportunities as well. So I wouldn't immediately close the door on trade, as there could be opportunities, but really the question is how to strike the right balance between the trade that we want and the trade that we don't want, and it's a continued discussions that we need to have.
Yeah, thank you, Shunta. Okay, so I think we got to go to the next question. Dr. Rajesh, there's a question specifically for you now, I think.
Yes.
Can you give an example of a country in the Global South that ITC has engaged with, and the country who are having difficulties in their transition to the circular economy, or in joining circular economy value chains?
Yeah, thank you. See, as earlier speakers have already said, this is a new concept, and obviously the developing countries are slow to join this bandwagon, but two kinds of issues that we have handled even in the early stages of this endeavor. One, there are certain voluntary standards which have been put in place by the buyers, seeking products in the advanced country markets, and therefore the traceability, environmental, footprint, etc., along the value chain. The countries are demanding more and more, capacity building to be able to provide that traceability on fulfillment of environmentally sustainable standards and human rights standards as well. That's one kind of work which is in great demand and people really want to get into it. Second is, we have worked in 2 countries, I will refrain from giving the names, where they are kind of developing their industrial development strategies, and obviously given the emphasis on greening, they would definitely like to put digitization and greening, trend towards these in their industrial development strategies. And there, the main, I would say, challenge is to make a business case for greening. Everybody likes to compare, and that's what I was also trying to emphasize in my initial presentation, that you need to absolutely make it clear through evidence-based and other studies that it makes sense from a business cost competitiveness, profitability perspective to shift to green, that it is more beneficial than using the traditional methods using primary raw materials. And this is, a more appropriate. So these are the, I would say, 2 challenges which we have come across in the initial stages of dealing with this subject. Obviously, as we go forward, we will be able to share much more and get much more experience from the ground. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, this is good to know. Actually, yeah, sharing the experience of the ground in the future will really be relevant, especially if we can then show examples that can be then models or inspiration for other countries to follow. So that's really like an emerging area where also we're trying to understand more. So there are a few other questions here. I think I might jump to this one here by Mushtaq Mimon, who raises the issue of EPR, the extended producer responsibility, with respect to original equipment manufacturers or the local importers. Maybe I'll just, to the panel, whoever wants to answer that one. So how do you see this connection between EPR policies that operate maybe on national level with the trade aspect of the circular economy? Maybe Christoph, do you feel comfortable talking about that?
Sure. Yes. I mean, I think the EPR schemes, and of course, one of the challenge is that has been said is they're mostly developed at the national level, I think one issue arises in terms of the different requirements that may exist across different jurisdictions, and in some cases these requirements may even be contradictory. In some cases you have to do this, and in others, don't do that. So I guess that's one aspect that needs to be taken into account. Another aspect is also to see whether meeting the extended producer responsibilities, the obligations, can be done through trade, or do you have to do this, nationally? So if you have an obligation to recycle, can you do it through trade, or not? And this, depending on how the scheme is designed. If not, maybe that may create a problem. If yes, there may be also concerns that there is a possibility to avoid your responsibilities by just exporting waste, for example. So that's, I think, another connection directly with the trade dimension.
Yeah, thank you, Christoph. And
And
Shunta, you have your hand up. Do you want to come in on this?
Yes, can I also come in on this? It's a very similar angle. Maybe I'd like to make 2 points, and the first angle is very much related to Christoph's intervention, but I think extended producer responsibility schemes in the past, I think they were not hoping to incentivize design for environment as they would have, and therefore the more recent discussions are how they can incentivize design for environment, such as phasing out hazardous substances or making products more recyclable, and so on and so forth. And therefore, like, differentiating end-of-life fees is a big topic right now. And therefore, you would not want to only distinguish how much the weight of products you put on the market or how much quantity, but you want to put in different scales of whether they're hazardous or not, recyclable or not. And as Christoph said, these initiatives are mushrooming in different jurisdictions and not necessarily coordinated. So how do you ensure that regulatory fragmentation doesn't happen is one important aspect to keep in mind. And the second point is that EPR systems aim to sort of make the businesses responsible for end-of-life costs, and therefore whoever puts a product on the market, whether the producer or the importer, would chip in for the end-of-life costs. But where the product is exported to another country as secondhand goods, they can be considered as leakage from the system, and the cost, the collected fees don't necessarily follow. So this leakage issue is also an issue that's come and goes, and I think a lot of people are still scratching their heads how to go forward with this, but there has been concerns around this issue as well.
Okay, thank you, Shunta. And a few more questions. I think we might not be able to cover all of them, but there's one about the digital product passport, which is a topic that's been discussed quite a while, and it's also part of, for example, EU circular economy strategies, etc. So the question here is, if a digital product passport could address the difficulty of assessing how circular a traded product is. And there's a comment by on this as well about the challenges of implementing a digital product passport across borders. Do you have, based on your work that you've been doing, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, one thing that we can say, I guess, Patrick, to that one is, first of all, there's an obvious difficulty when it comes to harmonization and availability of data requirements, and the burden that it puts on the producers as well, which raises interesting and slightly puzzling questions around, do producers and people who put the products or the components on the market even have access to that? So there's a big black hole. Do they even know what they actually put on the market? In many cases, and in the interviews that we've done early on in our inquiries around the feasibility of such a product passport, a lot of companies readily admit, though they would not necessarily do it openly and in public, that in many cases they just have no clue, and that would mean doing a lot of investigation, which is quite worrying when it comes to understanding that what we have in circulation, if nobody knows what it is, then we probably shouldn't have it in the first place. And the second dimension is that notion of a product passport has been linked to questions around proportion of recycled content, durability, repairability, etc., etc. If it goes ahead and if there's real traction behind it, why not make it more systemic and include the carbon footprint of the product where it was made, the environmental impact, and have a comprehensive framework in order to address the negative environmental impacts of the product during its production phase, and not only how it can be handled at the end of its life. It's probably a big ask, because then it's yet another set of requirements and data challenges. But because we're still scratching our heads around that idea of a product passport, why not try to find ways to make it comprehensive instead of looking at it to solve only one bit of the issue?
Thank you, Joss. Anyone else who'd like to come in on this? Otherwise, I think we might just be on time and finish with the session here. I just wanted to, from my side, well, first of all, thank you all. It was really good discussion, lots of important issues that have been raised, and I just want to, there's another question about what is the amount of trade goods currently globally, or for some countries, that can be considered to be circular. Just maybe to plug in the recent report that we at Chatham House published, where we tried to quantify both the volumes and the value of circular trade. I'll put the link to that report in the chat, and you'll be able to see that. Other than that, again, thanks to you all, Shunta, Dr. Agarwal, Christoph, and Joss. You've raised a lot of interesting challenges. I hope the second panel, which is about this, the solutions and answers, can come up with the responses to all the challenges that we've raised. And at this point, then, I want to hand over to Glenn Wilson from UNCTAD, who will moderate the next session. Glenn, are you there?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Thanks, Patrick. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Excellent. Thanks very much for moderating that first session. Very interesting to listen to. Thanks also to the speakers for joining. This second session, we're going to focus, as Patrick pointed out, on the solutions, the most promising solutions, but also any solutions that we don't yet know are promising. And we have 5 speakers. The rules are similar to, well, they're exactly the same actually as what they were for the first section. So about 5 minutes per speaker. And I will kick each speaker off with a question. And then we'll have around 20 minutes, hopefully, at the end of the session for questions from the audience and some discussion as well. So the first speaker we have is Leslie Sajou, International Consultant on Trade and Environment at the International Trade Center. Leslie, my ITC often works close to the realities on the ground. So my question for you is, how could developing countries be better supported in their efforts to boost the circular economy through trade policies? So I'll hand the floor over to you to see if you can answer that for us.
Thank you, Glenn. I hope you can hear me well. So thank you for having me. Thank you. So I think in the first session, it was made very clear that the trade-related policies are one tool that will be critical to boost or hinder the development of the circular value chain. And national, regional, and international policy framework could really support the adoption of more circular business model, reduce potential trade disputes, and allow the flow of goods and services that are beneficial for both the society and the environment. Hence, conscious efforts should be made by the governments to integrate circularity principles into their trade policies and negotiations frameworks. Though trade-related policy options and strategies seems to be lagging behind in efforts to adopt and implement more circularity in their policy frameworks, and it is obvious that policy gaps as well as capacity constraints will have to be addressed to exit linear processes and ensure more circularity in the near future. However, developing countries and least developed countries may lack, as usual, the human, financial, technical, and technological capacity to fully implement their national plans and policies related to circular economy. or also have the challenges in translating relevant circular economy principles they have signed on to at the regional and bilateral level into their national policy frameworks, including on trade. So let me give you one example, the one of the framework for circular economy that the ASEAN Economic Community adopted back in October 2021. And if you look closely at the suggested policy actions to be taken towards more circular policy frameworks in the member countries, there are some of the proposed policy actions that are directly related or impacting trade. First, the plan suggests, for instance, to develop and promote the utilization of mutual recognition agreements for products and services embedding circularity principles. Another thematic is encouraging protection of intellectual property for environmentally sound technologies to foster innovations that promote circular economy. Another one suggests to reorient the financial and investment policies to prioritize more responsible and sustainable businesses and infrastructure. And the list goes on. So to keep track of the various developments happening that are impacting their trade policy space and be able to undertake the necessary policy reforms, technical assistance is required to enable developing countries to holistically revise their policy frameworks and coherently implement it, so that it benefits their businesses, the people, and the environment. These efforts to adjust their policy and regulatory frameworks need to be contextualized in view of their respective economic, social, and environmental profile. So that will be dependent on each of the countries that we'll be looking at. And in line with what Rajesh was saying during the first session, it is critical for circular economy to be treated as an additional component of any national industrial development strategy and ensuring a coherent and appropriate integration of trade policy instruments. So more specifically, what ITC can do to support public and private stakeholders in developing countries. First, we can support them in undertaking reviews of their economic, trade, and investment policy to assess if it currently supports circular economy and proposes avenue to revise it accordingly. ITC can also support to develop roadmaps for the design and implementation of trade and investment policy that foster the transition to a more circular economy. We can also assist the developing countries to develop negotiating position for international trade and investment negotiation in support of a transition to a circular economy. So that can be negotiating position at the multilateral level, continental, regional, or even the bilateral levels. I can also add that when it comes to the private sector, we can support them to enhance their capacity to articulate their views and advocate for trade and investment related policy that support their ability to seize the opportunities and cope with the challenges that may stem from a transition to a circular economy. Finally, ITC can also support in sharing experiences, promoting more regional collaboration and even cross-country collaboration between nations that are front runners in the domain and others with more limited knowledge and capacities, including on policy revision and implementation, which can pave the way towards more circularity. Let me finish by saying that a key parameter in ITC assistance will be to ensure that the local specificities are embedded into the strategies, the policies, and the regulations developed. And as circular economy will have different meaning for citizens in Africa, in Asia, or even people living in rural areas and those in big cities. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much for that, Leslie. Perfectly in time as well, and you packed a lot in there. So ITC has many different solutions covering many different areas, from supporting the governments to supporting the private sector, and promoting regional and international collaboration. So that's quite broad, but also quite specific. So hopefully maybe we can discuss if we have enough time later on. Now to our second speaker, Dr. Badri Narayanan, the head of Trade, Commerce and Strategic Economic Dialogue at Niti Aayog, a Government of India think tank. Dr. Badri, importing plastics is often cheaper than material substitutes. So my question for you, or our question for you, is it time to rethink tariff schedules of countries to promote alternatives which lead to more reuse and material reductions, more reuse of the plastics, or material reduction in the use? I hand over to you now, Dr. Badri.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. This is a great opportunity for me to interact with all of you. To begin with, I would like to stress on the importance of this intersection between trade and circular economy. So this whole event is very meaningful and very topical at this point. It's high time we think about these aspects. Coming to the specific question that you have posed to me, I think there are several dimensions to this. One is the let me talk about countries in general, and then come to India's context particularly. So in the broadly, globally, since plastics are more of intermediate inputs for most of production, many countries have been liberal in terms of tariff schedules when it comes to plastics, so that they can have cheaper inputs for production. Unless some countries have not looked into it thoughtfully, and from an economic perspective, this has been the broad strategy globally to keep the tariffs low on plastics. Purely from an economic perspective, because people are not so much thinking about the environmental implications and reuse and material reduction that you mentioned. So that is a kind of a reality that we have to grapple with, that globally tariffs are relatively low for plastics. And secondly, in many developing countries, we also have this this infant industry kind of argument, where we want to develop domestic industries. So from that perspective, there is an increasing trend to increase tariffs in many sectors. So the infant industry argument is a traditional argument, but now it is getting importance, not necessarily from the older thought processes, wherein we really thought about the initial setting up of an industry, but even in the context of failure of the domestic industries to develop over time. So if you look at the the US-China tariffs and several other global increases in tariffs, that is the context. So globally there has been a wave or tendency for countries to think of increasing tariffs, and plastics are not an exception in this broader trend as well. So countries are developing domestic capacities to manufacture many products, including plastics, rather than importing them. So that is a second trend to think about. Now coming to specifically to India, our experience. Firstly, we are not an exception to the broader trend that tariffs have been relatively low, although we have higher tariffs for many other sectors, many other commodities compared to the rest of the world. For plastics, we have had relatively low tariffs for the same reason that I mentioned before, that we want. We have been, the industry has been, Indian industry has been accusing the government of having this inverted duty structure, which actually means that we have higher tariffs on inputs and lower tariffs on finished goods, which is kind of harming the industry, because they are not able to access inputs at a low cost, and at the same time they are facing import competition at their level, at the finished products level globally, because of the low tariffs. But plastics is an exception to that broader, anomaly in the policy. So plastics have had low tariffs. However, in the recent years, India also has built a huge trade deficit in the sector. Basically, we are importing much more than what we are exporting in the plastics sector. So that is now, becoming a reason for the policymakers to think about it, not necessarily from a circular economy perspective, but from a self-reliance kind of perspective and trade deficit perspective. So we are thinking of raising tariffs and in many sectors, and plastics are no exception. Some tariffs have been increased there as well recently. However, another point to consider is that many developing countries, including India, have their capabilities in producing plastic products is very heterogeneous. In terms of producing low value plastic, they have a greater capability, and for producing the high value plastic that goes into automobiles, electronic components, etc., we don't have much capacity, and India is no exception there. We have really competitive capabilities in low value plastic, but not high value. I wanted to mention this because of one reason, that from the concept of reuse and material reduction and circular economy perspective, the low value plastics are not going to be that important or crucial. We need to just like the way we talk about transition from fossil fuels to renewables happens in phases. You first move from dirtier fossil fuels to cleaner fossil fuels, and then move to renewables. In the same way, we move from low value plastics to high value plastics, reusable plastics, and then we get into substitutes, the material substitutes that you mentioned in the question, right? So I think that transition has to be facilitated by developing capacity for these high value plastics. So and then getting into material substitutes. So now I think in terms of tariff schedule, there are two things to consider. One is to continue the trend of increasing tariffs when it comes to particularly the low value plastics and also the high value plastics, both types of plastics. But also we have to reduce tariffs on the material substitutes, so that we promote trade in terms of imports, in terms of the substitutes that are coming up, and then but then we also have to restrict the import of plastic, or not restrict, but make it a little more expensive. So now also another aspect is here, this area is highly dynamic and evolving. A lot of material substitutes are coming up, bioplastics are coming up, and so on. So now, as far as I can see, there are a lot of gaps in the tariff schedules themselves. The definition of even beyond tariff schedules, the definition of the tariff lines, the 6-digit codes, the 8-digit codes, to include many of these new materials, the new biomaterials, bioplastics, and so on. So I would actually go beyond what you're asking, like your question, which is mainly to consider the calibration of tariffs, tariff schedules, and so on in the trade agreements, in overall even unilateral trade policies, and so on, but also to consider including a lot of these commodities which are coming up and being developed by the R&D community. So that would be my broad response. I look forward to more discussions as we go forward.
Thank you very much. Very interesting perspective, and also very interesting. Interesting that you mention moving from lower value plastics to higher value reusable plastics before then moving on to substitutes. It's not always a leapfrog situation that is the most practical or most interesting. So thank you very much for your insights and perspective, and we can continue the discussion at the end. Our next speaker is Elizabeth Twerk, Director Economic Cooperation and Trade at the UN Economic Commission for Europe. My question for you, Elizabeth, is can you give some examples of your work with countries in the UNESE Economic Commission for Europe region, for example, in Central Asia or the Balkans, on how trade policy and regulatory tools could be used or revised to support more circular value chains? Over to you, Elizabeth.
Many thanks, Glenn, for this question, for the introduction. And let me also thank the Circular Innovation Lab for the invitation. It's always a great pleasure to be part of the World Circular Economy Forum. In UNECE, we've had quite some cooperation with the World Circular Economy Forum. And it's also great to see how many agencies are picking up this trade and circular economy topic right now. And maybe last word of introduction, I really would like to thank Jos, Shunta, and Patrick, who have been so helpful to UNECE and to me when we started working on circular economy some 2.5 years ago. So UNECE, as you already mentioned, Glenn, when posing the question, we cover a wide geographical space. We are a United Nations Regional Economic Commission for Europe, but we actually range from North America over Europe until Central Asia and everything in between, including Southern Caucasus, Balkan, and Eastern Europe. So we have a somewhat interesting space, including a lot of countries with economies in transition. And I would like to say that I guess many of the concerns or remarks that have been made about some of the developing countries in the discussion before, it's really important to also bear them in mind when we talk about countries with economies in transition who have their specific, I would say, developmental challenges. Now, in terms of how we look at circular economy, let me flag that in 2021, UNECE's 69th Commission, that's our highest governing body, was devoted to the topic of circular economy and the sustainable use of natural resources. And since then, we have in the different teams integrated circular economy into our work streams, and that includes work stream on trade, work stream on innovation, work stream on investment and financing, as examples of the ones hosted in my division, the Economic Cooperation and Trade Division. And I guess when I now make some points about policies and specific work with the countries, let me try to do that by linking it back what was said in panel 1. I didn't capture everything there, but I think there were some really, really important remarks. So I would want to flag that I guess the first key message is really we need to look at this sort of nexus between trade and the circular economy. And trade really can be an important enabler for circular economy, but really important also to look at the policy interactions with investment and with innovation so that we can make that happen. And when we look at this nexus between trade and circularity, it was great how Robert how Christoph went into some of the WTO legal cases, and they discussed the Article 20 and the WTO, I wouldn't want to say case law, but the issues that came up in this regard. And I was very pleased by the sort of like positive assessment we got by that, in terms of saying that most likely WTO really has the flexibility to allow for circular economy related trade policies. And I think there was a second important point on that made in the first panel, namely the importance of recognizing the business case for circular transition. So unless we can make the business case that companies have a benefit from going circular, and I would say unless we make the case that companies can increase their exports, that countries can increase their exports for the circular economy transition, I would think that's a really, really important message. And all of these messages also feature in UNECE papers and publications on circular economy. Now, when we look at circular economy, we don't only look at this trade, investment, innovation space, but we also look at specific hotspot sectors. Obviously, that's textiles, agri-food, and increasingly now minerals and critical minerals, which are important for the green transition as well. And maybe one last point in terms of the cross-cutting nature, which came up a little bit in the first panel, is this question about supply chains and supply chain traceability. I think we've had the reference to the digital product passport. So when we in UNECE look at circular economy and trade enabling policies, the idea of making supply chains circular and traceable is quite important here. And we do have a series of work streams with countries, including in Central Asia, where we really try to help them to make their supply chains traceable, and also to use digital technologies for this traceability, hoping that by being sort of like solid about what really happens to a product along the value chain, that not only makes the circularity claim more solid, but that also sort of like assuages any consumer concerns about this. Now, in UNEC, as I mentioned before, a large number of our member states are countries with economies in transition. So when we look at potential policy options, we really flag the development dimension. And that's like a common thread in our work. And I would say there are three areas. On the one hand, ensuring that circular economy is an enabler and not a barrier to trade, has been mentioned several times before. Secondly, increasing access to key technologies, so the innovation aspect, and I think somebody mentioned IPRs in this regard before. And thirdly, promoting and attracting circular investment and financing. So we really try to take a development angle to those three themes here, and obviously a lot of capacity building and technical assistance. And here now, Glenn, to come back to your specific question, I thought I'd give you 2 country examples, and I can name them. There are countries we work with quite a lot, and I've chosen 2 different ones. On the one hand, Serbia, and on the other hand, Tajikistan. So Serbia, a country in the Western Balkan, Tajikistan, a country in Central Asia. The economies differ quite a lot in terms of their size and in terms of the stage of the development of the economy. Also, one is a WTO member, the other one not yet. And the 2 countries also differ quite a bit in terms of the preparedness for circular economy. So Serbia already has a roadmap, quite sophisticated roadmap developed by the country in addition to its academia. And Tajikistan, when we did our workshop in Tajikistan just a few weeks ago, we were really the first agency to come and talk circular economy there. Yeah? So you have 2 very different sort of like stages. Now, when we work with the countries, we usually try to really respond to their needs about what's their priority. And we got from Serbia agri-food value chains, and we got from Tajikistan textiles and cotton. And so it's clear that for Serbia, food production, it's about 10% of the Serbian exports. It's sort of like the largest export product group, and we have a lot of SMEs in that space as well. And what we saw is that there is really a lack of information and knowledge about how to turn these agri-food value chains circular and how to promote circular business models also for SMEs. And there is a lack of understanding on the importance and the potentially market competitiveness enhanced, trade enhancing importance of circular economy. We found some great examples of Serbian SMEs turning circular and really like recasting their whole production process. And we are now, as we are developing a sector-specific roadmap with the country, we are obviously trying to build on these positive examples. Now, very different in Tajikistan. As I said, we were the first ones to talk circular economy there. We decided to zoom into textiles. Tajikistan is a major cotton exporter. Textile industry employs some 50% of total of people in the light industry. Tajikistan produces and exports a lot of cotton, I think also around 10% of the country's exports. And here it's quite interesting for us because traceability and circularity in the cotton production process, both downstream and upstream the value chain, is a topic we see in many countries all over the globe, also in Uzbekistan, in close neighborhood to Tajikistan. So we are really zooming into how to make the cotton production process more sustainable, more circular, and how to trace this along the value chain so that if you in Geneva buy a cotton shirt with Tajik cotton, that you really know that this is sustainable cotton and that we also know how this can be reused in a circular economy fashion. So these are 2 quite different examples from different regions, but I think are 2 very inspiring examples. And to close, let me flag that from a UNECE perspective, it's also really important to have a space for countries to show their experiences and share their experiences. And we are doing that quite a lot in Central Asia. So it's nice to see what Uzbekistan is doing on cotton traceability, what Tajikistan is doing on cotton traceability, and providing a space for countries to exchange. And here we also see our Circular Step network as a key element. That's our multi-stakeholder engagement platform that we have launched in spring, and where we are really trying to bring together the stakeholders, public and private, from the UNECE region, so from North America over Europe until Central Asia, to share their experiences on how to make, how to manage this transformation to a more circular economy. So with that, I think I'll close. Thank you for the invite. I'm really happy to see this topic move. It's great to see all these agencies coming together. And I really look forward to also linking up with the organizers and with the other speakers and seeing what we can do jointly. Also an invitation to join the UNECE events on circular economy and to basically together take this very important topic forward. With that, back to you, Glenn.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Really, really interesting. And I really like the point as well. And I think it's very important to stress the business case for the circular economy. And I think that can hopefully attract a lot more attention to it as well. Thank you. Moving on swiftly, we are a little bit behind time. Apologies for that. Moving on to Stefan Arditi, Director of Policy Integration and Circular Economy at the European Environmental Bureau. They are a knowledge partner of this event. And so we are very thankful for that and look forward to hearing from you. Our question for you is, according to the European Environmental Bureau's experience, what type of trade policy could foster a sound environment for circular business on the ground? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Thanks everyone for the invitation. I hope you hear me well. First, I'd like to step back a little bit and just ask ourselves, why do we speak about trade of circular goods or circular trade? I think it's because we are convinced that if we start trading more circular, we can also release a little bit the pressure on the planet, on the people, and make sure that with the carrying capacity of the planet, we still maintain a sustainable world and still we provide a lot of job and economic opportunities. I think it's very important to remind that we do not want to circularize trade just to circularize trade, but because we think it's important for a kind of goal which is above trading for trading. And I think if we consider this perspective, in a way, I'm not sure that exporting more volume should be the issue, but more like each time we trade a product or a good, can we always consider that this trade of product is a reservoir of functionality, a reservoir of material, a reservoir of values, and that this value retention is maximized so that we can trade several times the product or the material in this product and maintain the job opportunities. And if we also start from this perspective of product as a material and functionality reservoir, then we can identify at least two clear bottlenecks, which I think a lot of speakers have pointed to, which is the lack of information about what is exactly the product, even just saying that we still accept that the people place on the market product that not even aware of what's in it. So I think this is really a fundamental barrier to trade. Ignorance is a barrier to circular trade. And with this, we know that, I don't say it's easy, but we've got this tool of a digital product passport where we can progressively alleviate this ignorance and release important information, notably with regard the material, the type of material, the type of chemicals which are in the product, but also maybe some other information such as how long certain components have been in the product, have they been changed, something that we usually know more or less when, for example, we buy a new car. We ask what type of repair have been done, and in certain countries, it's even required to sell a kind of second-hand car with this kind of information. The second thing I think people have identified is the fact that when a product reach another country, if it's used and discarded in another country, then there might be some kind of bad impact if the materials are not sustainably managed at the end of life of the material. It can create pollution, if we do not pay attention to the chemicals, but also a lot of missed opportunity because those products are not, for example, properly collected, or the dismantling of this product is not enabled because we don't have the skill, or because we do not necessarily have the investment in place to make the best of the valuable material we can recover from this product. And I think here we've got a tool, which is the extended producer responsibility. But so far, we've, I think, considered it as if it was kind of blocked at the boundary of a country or a region. So with this, I think that if we could combine this idea of a digital product passport, not being naive in terms of effort, which will alleviate the information gap, with this extended producer responsibility that could be linked to the product and follow the product all along its trading steps, I would say, making sure that wherever it ends up as waste, we've got the financial means to try to make the best out of this waste material, separate the hazardous material, treat them well while recovering and re-injecting in the economy the material. I think we can really circularize trade and enhance the possibility of this. So I think rather than, I would say, focusing on the difficulty to implement a right EPA and digital product passport, which all we acknowledge, I think we need to share what can be really, I would say, already consolidated and share as best practice around these two tools. And I think then one thing to harmonize trade is a lot of people think about, codes and standard, and we think about how can we differentiate between, for example, secondary raw material and waste, or material to remanufacture and waste. But I'm pushing it a bit further. And I say, can we harmonize that any information available in one place of the world, for example, an information generated at EU level, will be available for any country, any place in the world, because we know that there is a unique code associated to this product, and this product traveling everywhere in the world can be associated to this digital product passport and this extended producer responsibility financial fees that will allow us to capture the opportunity. So this is the vision I'd like that we work on. And with this, then I'm questioning, I have no certainty that the model we've developed in so-called developed country should be replicated in low and medium income country. I think if we can change the design of product, what is super important is to inform, is to train the people so that labor-intensive dismantling, sorting, and kind of sometimes low-tech recovery process, which does not mean they are not super ingenious, but maybe more adapted to a labor-intensive society rather than capacity investment, should be developed. And I'm not convinced that the way we've developed, again, in so-called developed countries, should be necessarily replicated. This being said, I'm not naive. We have to deal with a lot of legacy product, and I think we can start with something. For example, a lot of manufacturers still have a bill of material of their product. They may not be completely aware, but this is somewhere available. Why don't we try to build on this bill of material and require or incentivize the availability of this as a kind of first step toward a full digital product passport? We've got products which are shipped for reuse from one country to another country. If consumers have paid some fees to ensure the proper waste management, how can we make sure that the fees paid in one country follow the product so that the receiving country can have already some financial means to make something out of those products and not be, I would say, asked and delegated the task developed country cannot perform without this fee paid by producer. So to conclude, I would say that if we really want to circularize trade, I think what I've understood from the previous speaker is that we need to make circular trade more stronger and more resilient. And for this, I think there are some models we need to work on. For example, can we ensure that we've developed global value chain along textile, along electronics, where some recycled material of high quality become the raw material of the manufacturing site in another country. In Europe, for example, we speak a lot about recycling textile, but we are not necessarily manufacturers. Can we send high quality recycled textile to India and Pakistan so that we do not have to grow new cotton or to produce new polyester necessarily, but at least we can build on these high quality recycled fibers. Another thing I think we need to think, can we provide some quality requirement so that long lasting goods are produced, which will also require in a way more work per each item produced. So when we fear that if we reduce the overconsumption, unsustainable consumption, we will endanger the jobs. We also think, okay, can we change our consumption pattern so that at least some quality jobs, can be developed and maintained because we change also the requirement. And by saying that, know that some countries, including, for example, Rwanda, they develop their own system or homemade in Rwanda, very quality, for example, shirts and textile that they try to sell, and that also, I would say, employ local workforce. So I think let's think together, not necessarily of making more of the same thing, but how we can really circularize trade, make sure the circular trade is the most competitive, and then develop the tools in terms of alleviating the ignorance and the lack of financial means. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Very interesting, especially the importance of the digital passport and better tracing of what happens to goods, even if we do send them back to be remanufactured. Is that happening? How are we tracing it? How do we know what's going on? Can people trust the system? Very interesting. And a very good comment about ignorance being a barrier to circular trade. That leads us nicely on to Arpit Bhutani, the COO of the Circular Economy Lab, who we have a question for on consumers. Consumers in foreign markets often do not know how products are made and what happens after they are discarded. How can we enhance transparency and awareness in the value chain? Arpit, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Glenn, so much. I want to pick up from where Stefan said. I think the solution will not just be there by ensuring transparency around the value chain. If Global South continues to produce, let's say, textiles and continue to export a huge amount of textiles in the same way that is being done right now, it's not going to solve the problem even when the information is there. As long as we remain in the GDP-focused model of linear economies of scale, where we want to manufacture more and more of primary products and export more and more to actually follow the same economic system that we've been following since the past 100 years, it is not going to circularize trade. Circular trade will only happen when we follow all the R's of reduce, reuse, repairing across national borders, even reusing with good quality products with proper standards across the borders. That's when it's going to happen. Coming to the question on the transparency, that being there, it is important, but at the moment, the only country the only place that it's possible to do is in the EU. Even there, it is a humongous task, because when you come to cross-border transfer of knowledge, I often feel that when you visit manufacturers and when you speak to them, a lot of this information that we want them to add to the digital product passport is usually proprietary information as well, and there are some information that add to their competitive advantage that they may not want to share. So we need to and we need to also have some kind of standards around the data we collect from them, the methods by which we do the life cycle assessments. Because if we don't have these standardization when we collect the data in the product passport, there could be an opportunity, there could be a possibility that same products by different manufacturers will have hugely different data in terms of sustainability and circularity. So we need to have some background standards being set on how the data has to be collected and how the data has to be analyzed. Additionally, when it comes to digital product passports, there could be also some kind of an issue around transferring of knowledge and transferring of information between different countries. And that, I think Stefan has already pointed out that we need to look at harmonization in that case. And for digital product passports to work across national borders, harmonization is definitely the key. And also, I think creating ERP systems between the all across the exporter and manufacturer, as well as the importer and the import receiving countries. ERP systems will have a lot of information around that can be tallied regularly with the product passport and move across the borders as well. So I think, Glenn, that's what I'd like to add. Thanks.
Thanks, Arpit. Sorry, couldn't find the unmute button there. Yeah, very interesting. Harmonization, very important. And as Circular Economy Lab tries to do, shedding light on solutions to the transition to a circular economy. So that work is as important as it always has been, if not more important. The more solutions we have, the more light needs to be shed on them so they can actually be enacted. So thank you very much for that. We have gone a bit over time, but I think maybe we have some time for a couple of questions. I'd like to, there's one question here for all the panelists. So I think it might be a good opportunity to let whoever feels they have something to say to jump in on this one. At the moment, do you all think current trade policy regime is an enabler for the circular economy or more of a barrier? Yeah, maybe Dr. Badri could start with the answer to this one, and anyone else can jump in after that.
Yeah. No, it's a great question, and I think it requires a lot of deep introspection by the trade policy makers, sitting together with the circular economy, experts, because there are a lot of elements that are in the current trade policy regime globally that may be construed or interpreted as facilitators of circular trade, circular economy, and there are also a lot of barriers. In my very kind of preliminary kind of glance at the trade policies, I think the barriers are more than the facilitators. So maybe I can highlight one or two examples. So we just discussed some time ago about the plastics and also the other aspects where the tariff structure is not so much of an enabler. Typically, you have the firms have greater incentives to just keep buying new stuff rather than reusing and recycling. So that is one aspect. The second aspect is, particularly in the developing countries, traditionally the trade in waste has been kind of a negative in the past. Such trade just the waste from the developed countries to the developing countries because there's not much capacity to reuse, recycle. These concepts were not there earlier. So a lot of times, we have seen enough, news and discussion about how places, certain places in China and in India and other African countries have become like dumping yards for the waste from the developed countries. So because of that, a lot of rules have been calibrated in countries like India to make sure that such dumping doesn't happen. So, for example, several years ago, we kind of made it very difficult to import used car, old car, for example, and e-waste is another aspect which has actually been banned in terms of imports. So I think this is a very touchy topic to be addressed. On one hand, we have to facilitate this trade of waste. But on the other hand, we also understand the pitfalls of that, because if you, for example, encourage imports of e-waste, of course, a lot of it is going to be reused, recycled. You may, for example, extract rare earths in lithium and so on from the smartphone that has failed. But also a lot of other parts of that same smartphone can be dumped. It can be actual waste, which is not being reused. So I think that there must be some kind of rules and regulations in terms of while facilitating this trade in waste, there has to be some kind of requirements that more than 90% or 95% of the waste that is being imported has to be recycled, reused, remanufactured, and so on. So I think these kind of things have to be thought through. And also, as I also mentioned earlier, the tariff lines have to be evolved. We have to include things like biomaterials and so on in the tariff lines, even to the level of 6-digit codes. That is another trade policy regime that has to evolve over globally. Yeah, I think those are some limited points I want to make on this. Thank you.
Thank you for that. If anyone else would like to say anything else on that question, we have come to the end of our time, but I think we can be a bit flexible for a few minutes if anyone would like to add anything to that. I'll just re-ask the question in case it helps. At the moment, do you all think current trade policy regime is an enabler for circular economy or more of a barrier?
Glenn, may I? Glenn, if we look at trade being in the traditional sense of take, make, dispose, then definitely it is a barrier. But if you look at it in a way of either reusing, remanufacturing, repairing, and recycling, then trade provides such opportunities that is unimaginable. For instance, they could also help displace demand for new materials and products and provide affordable access to substitute materials. So we have to see, when we ask the question whether is trade a barrier or not, we have to see in what context we're looking at trade. Are we looking at it what we've been looking at since forever, or are we looking at it in the newer models of circular economy and newer economic models of reuse, reduce, remanufacturing, and all of that? So just one short comment, but thanks.
Thanks, Arpit. That was really well put. Trade is both a barrier and also provides great opportunity for the circular economy. I think what I'll do now is hand over to Apurva for closing remarks. But before I do that,
then we have
sorry, I didn't see you, Elizabeth. Please go ahead.
No, don't worry. Because you've just said it so eloquently before. I think we really need to look at that in a nuanced way, because both trade and trade policy are so multifaceted that you can't have a clear-cut answer. And I think trade and trade policy can be enablers and can be also barriers. And what is really important is that we now have so many discussions, also here in Geneva, about how to harness the power of trade for the circular economy transition. And I think it's really a unique momentum to frame a positive narrative and to make that work. And at the same time, I think we've had in the chat a comment about us talking too much trade and business and not much enough the planetary boundaries. And I would say, as the UN, we always look at all the SDGs, and we do have our SDG 12 on sustainable consumption and production, but also, of course, life below water, life on Earth, and the climate protection. So I would say they all go very much together. And it's great that we are in that together as well as the agencies. So now back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth, for picking up on that question as well. yes, of course, that at the end of the day is also what we're all working towards. So thank you very much. Unless anyone else has anything to add now, I will hand over to Apurva. And before I do that, I'd just like to thank you to all the speakers for your time and for sharing your knowledge and your expertise and some very interesting examples as well. That always livens things up and really helps us to concretely understand situations which and concepts and ideas and barriers and opportunities which sometimes are not so easy to understand without the examples. So that's very useful. So Apurva, I'll hand over to you for the closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Glenn. I think it's been a fantastic event so far with tremendous insights from both the sessions. The first session really highlighted the range of challenges from infrastructure issues, custom procedures, and trade facilitation and mechanisms and standards and so on. And at the same time, the second session shared some really interesting perspectives on tackling these challenges by emphasizing the importance of trade policy frameworks to enable supply chain traceability, access to technology and finance to do so, and increasing both technical capacity and the standardization, as well as the harmonization of knowledge between countries. So I'd really like to thank both our panelists and our moderators, Patrick and Glenn, for putting together such fantastic sessions. And a special mention to Dr. Enrique Puccini from UNCTAD, who's been instrumental in putting together this event, but unfortunately couldn't be part of it today. And a thanks to, of course, our partners, both UNCTAD, Chatham House, ITC, and EEB. And last but not the least, a big thanks to our audience today, who has been really engaging and has posed some really important questions. I wish you all a really great weekend ahead. Thank you so much for today.